Hi everyone, today we're going to take a look at a new lens from Viltrox. It's their 56mm f1.7 autofocus lens for APS-C crop sensor cameras. And Viltrox was very kind to send me their Fujifilm X mount version for this review, but it's also available for the Nikon Z mount. And as always, I'll give you my honest and fair opinion. Now this lens is part of a new generation of lenses from Viltrox that are designed to be lightweight, low cost, and very high performance. And I can tell you that this lens meets all of those qualities in spades. Now the headline feature for me is that this is an autofocus lens for only $139. Now you might expect there's going to be some serious compromises either in the build quality or in the optical quality, but not as much as you might think. Now, unlike some of their other lenses, which are made of metal, this lens has a plastic body. Now, it feels like a nice quality plastic and everything is very well put together. And the lens mount itself is still all metal. And as you can see here, it also has a USB-C port for doing firmware upgrades, which is always nice to have. And it comes with that kind of this dinky lens hood, which is very small. It's not really big enough to give really any kind of cover to minimize flaring, but it will serve its purpose of at least helping to protect the front element from knocks and dings. Now the operation of the lens has been very simplified. All it has is a focusing ring, which is actually very nicely dampened, and I found it very easy to manually focus the lens when I wanted to. But there's no aperture ring, there's no function buttons, and the lens is not weather sealed. So this basically accomplishes two of the three pillars I mentioned, being very low cost at just $139 and is very lightweight at just 171 grams. And as you can see from the images, it's a relatively small lens considering it's a short telephoto with a fast f1.7 aperture. So that leads us to the third pillar in that how does this lens perform? So we need to look at a few things. Basically, we're going to be looking at the autofocusing performance, and we're also going to be looking at the optical qualities of this lens. And long story short, this lens really punches above its weight, and there's very few compromises here as well. Now, when it comes to autofocus, the lens uses an STM motor or a stepping motor. And I found it to be very, very fast. As you can see here, it goes from point A to point B and back to point A very, very quickly. And I really don't have any complaints here, except every once in a while, I'll get a false positive like you see in this image here. And then when it comes to continuous autofocus, whether I was doing video or doing stills, the lens performed very well. I didn't have any problems. It went from point A to point B very quickly, very accurately. And when I turned on things like face detect, the lens was able to keep up with me as I walked back and forth with no problems at all. So overall, I'm really happy with the autofocusing. I mean, it was very fast, it was accurate, it worked well with the subject and face detect, and the focusing motors are virtually silent. I didn't really pick those up into the internal mics, but it's very noisy where I am, so generally you're going to be using external mics anyway. Now, when it comes to the false positive that I got, I didn't notice it really at all when I was out on my photo walks. It was only until I got back here and started doing these point A to point B testing where every now and then I did get a false positive. Now, there may be a firmware update for the lens or it might be a firmware update for the camera, but either way, I just thought I'd let you know. All right, now let's talk about some of the optical qualities of this lens. And again, I'm shooting on my Fujifilm X-H2 with its 40 megapixel sensor, and you can see wide open here at f1.7. You know, we have great sharpness, but the contrast is just a little bit low. And when we go out to the corners, the contrast improves a little, but then the sharpness is just off slightly. And stopping down to f2 didn't make much difference, but at f2.8, we have excellent contrast and sharpness. And this only improves when we get up to f5.6 and f8, and then it drops off again when we get to f11, f16 due to diffraction. The other thing I noticed was that there is some minor vignetting when we start at f1.7, and again, that kind of goes away by f4, f5, 6, and this is something very easily fixed in post-processing. In fact, I didn't notice it really in my testing here, but I did notice it in my real-life images. So if you look at this shot here, if you look at the skies and the corners, you can see that it's a little bit of vignetting there, but you know, just a quick click of the button and it goes away just like that. I also noticed some very, very minor pincushion distortion that is, again, easily corrected. I just dialed in about a 5 on my slider, but you can see the difference is very, very subtle and most people won't even notice it. And another thing I looked for was like some chromatic aberrations or purple and green fringing, and this is extremely well controlled. I saw a hint of like green fringing wide open, but by f2.8 it was completely gone. And honestly, in any of the shots that I took in the real world, I didn't see it at all. So at this point, I'd have to say the lens is performing exceptionally well and punching above its weight, and the imperfections that I showed you are relatively minor and can be easily corrected in post-processing, just like you would do really with any lens. Now there is one optical characteristic of this lens that I found a little weak, and that's when it comes to ghosting and flaring. And honestly, I found this to be an issue with a lot of third-party lenses or budget lenses, and that's when you're shooting into direct sunlight or it's very bright sun coming in at the right angle into the lens, you start to lose contrast and you might see some ghosting. But generally speaking, I think it's fairly well controlled, and stopping down helps a little bit, and I think also using a longer lens hood would mitigate this somewhat as well. But that said, I like to use the ghosting and flaring creatively sometimes, which kind of brings me to some other characteristics of this lens that are a little bit more subjective, and that is the sun stars and also the bokeh or autofocus area quality. Now generally speaking, sun stars are not really a thing when it comes to short telephoto and telephoto lenses, and this one is no exception. Now I did try to get some sun stars in my images by stopping down and angling the sun around the corner, but it was really an uphill battle. So this lens is not really made for sun stars. If you want sun stars, usually you go for wider angle lenses anyway. Now when it comes to the autofocus areas and speculars or bokeh, I think that's where this lens really shines. Now wide open at f2.8, I found the background blur to be very smooth and creamy with a nice transition from in-focus areas to the autofocus areas. Now there is a little bit of a cat's eye effect towards the corners, but it's pretty minimal, and just stopping down to f2.8, it completely goes away and you have very, very nice round bokeh balls in the speculars. And as you stop the lens down further, even in this very busy background, the autofocus areas still stay very smooth. Now one other aspect I want to touch on about the background blur, and the reason I think it's so creamy is because of the optical design of this lens. Now if you look at it, it's relatively sophisticated for a short telephoto. I mean, it has 11 elements and 9 groups, but I want you to notice that there's actually no spherical glass in this design. Now spherical elements were a big step in the advancement of lens design, and basically what they did is they reduced the number of elements needed to make all of these optical corrections to improve image quality. So lenses could be made smaller and lighter and still have excellent image quality, but there are a couple of caveats with the spherical lenses. One is they're more expensive and difficult to make, and two is they cause that onion ringing effect that you see a lot of times in the speculars, even in very expensive lenses. And to minimize or eliminate this onion ring effect takes a very sophisticated manufacturing process in the polishing of lenses, which is really only reserved for the very top tier, most expensive glass that you can find. And I think this is why some people like using older vintage lenses before spherical elements became more commonplace, because it does give your images a little bit of a different look and feel to them. Anyway, take all of that with a grain of salt. Now let's take a look at some of the images I took with this lens and talk about the 57mm focal length in general. So 57mm is kind of the de facto focal length for doing portrait photography because it's that 85mm equivalent on full frame. And you use this when you want to get really nice separation between your subject and the background. You're really not trying to include too much information from the environment. You want the focus to be on your subject. So again, it's ideal for doing people and pets and flowers and anything where you just want to capture the subject itself and minimize the background. And I think that's where this lens does exceptionally well because of the very smooth rendition of the background. You can use this for street photography. I struggled with it a little bit because I much prefer wider angle lenses when I'm doing street, but you still can include some of the environment if you get back far enough, and you'll still get a little bit of that separation of the subject from other objects in the scene. But generally speaking, this lens is best used for doing close-ups and portrait photography. Now, when you're doing smaller subjects like flowers, the closest focusing distance of this lens is only like ½ meter. So you can't get very close to things like when you're doing flowers. So you can overcome this or work around this by just using extension tubes like I did for this particular flower here and some of the other shots. That allowed me to get much closer to the subject and isolate it from the surrounding leaves and foliage. And another thing that worked out really well was focus bracketing and later stacking in Photoshop with the extension tubes that allowed me to get this tack sharp image of this tulip. So in conclusion, I can highly recommend this lens. I mean, it's extremely sharp, the autofocusing is fast and accurate, and any optical defects that I talked about are relatively minor with the exception of the flaring. And at $139, I think it's a no-brainer. Just get this lens. That's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope to see you again soon.